Inside a quiet display case in a small Wiltshire museum, a 4,000-year-old skeleton has been sitting for over 2 decades, and it's been quietly unraveling who actually gets credit for building Stonehenge. He's not the king the label claims he is. He's something stranger, proof that the people who built Stonehenge were, within a few centuries of his death, almost completely erased from Britain's gene pool. Salisbury Museum still calls him the King of Stonehenge, a nickname archaeologists have spent 20 years quietly trying to correct, without much luck. Andrew Fitzpatrick led the dig that pulled him out of the ground. He called it the find of a lifetime. He didn't yet know the science coming years later would take his own discovery and turn it into something far more complicated than a king. It happened in May 2002 in Amesbury, Wiltshire, 3 miles from the Stone Circle. Construction workers clearing ground for a new housing estate broke into a grave holding almost 100 objects, more than any other early Bronze Age burial ever found in Britain. Gold, copper, arrowheads built for war, and a secret buried in his teeth that nobody would understand for years. Look closer at what's actually inside that case. Gold catches the light first. 2 tiny, basket-shaped ornaments, the oldest securely dated gold objects ever found in this country. Beside them, copper knives, still sharp enough to photograph well, laid out like they were arranged for a funeral no one was supposed to forget. Stone wrist guards, 16 flint arrowheads, barbed and tanged, built for hunting or for war. Boar tusks, a shale belt ring, small stone anvils called cushion stones, the kind a metalworker presses hot copper against. Nearly 100 objects in total, more than any other grave from this period in the whole of Britain. Archaeologists don't use the word richest carelessly. They use it because nothing else from this era comes close. The man himself was ordinary in one sense, 35 to 45 years old, buried crouched on his left side, face turned north, in a grave so shallow the construction crew almost missed it entirely. Fitzpatrick's team had gone in expecting pipeline trenches and post holes. What came out of the ground instead rewrote what archaeologists thought early Bronze Age Britain even looked like. A society they'd assumed was mostly flat, mostly equal, mostly humble. This grave said otherwise. This grave said somebody, somewhere was very rich, very early, and very connected to power. The nickname arrived within days, courtesy of the press, not the excavation report. Catchy, clean. 6 words that turned a stranger into a monarch. And it stuck so hard that decades later, museum visitors still read it off the wall and take it as fact. No archaeologist ever signed off on King. No excavation report says he built anything. It was a story that outran the science, and it's been quietly wrong for over 20 years, and the deeper you dig into who this man actually was, the less this becomes a story about one wealthy grave near a famous monument, and the more it becomes about something that happened to an entire population, at almost exactly the same moment he was buried. Rewind to that morning in May, before anyone knew what they'd found. The trench cut through ordinary Wiltshire chalk, the kind of ground that has swallowed thousands of unremarkable burials over thousands of years. Then a trowel hit pottery, then another, then the outline of a crouched skeleton, and beside it, an amount of grave goods so dense that excavators had to slow down and photograph every centimeter before lifting anything. Wessex Archaeology's team, led by Andrew Fitzpatrick, spent days on a burial that should have taken hours. Black and white and color photographs from that dig still exist. Gloved hands hovering over pottery rims, string grids laid across the trench, notebooks filling with measurements nobody expected to need. What emerged, item by item, was a portrait of a man who mattered. 5 beaker pots, the signature drinking vessels of a culture spreading across Europe at the time. 3 copper knives, soft, more ornamental than practical, the kind you'd display rather than fight with. A red wrist guard by his knees, a black one on his forearm, both associated with archery, the gold ornaments likely worn in the hair, and the cushion stones, small, unglamorous, easy to overlook, and the single most important clue in the entire grave. Cushion stones are anvils, portable ones, the kind a smith carries to work metal on the move. They make this man as far as anyone has found, Britain's earliest known metalworker, not a farmer, not a chieftain by birthright, a craftsman who could do something almost nobody on this island could do yet, turn raw copper and gold into objects of power. That single detail should have changed the headline. It didn't. Metalworker doesn't sell papers the way king does, but metalworking explains the wealth far better than kingship ever could. Metal was new technology in Britain around this time, arriving from the European mainland alongside a wider cultural package archaeologists call the beaker phenomenon, new pottery styles, new burial customs, new tools spreading fast. A man who could produce the first gold and copper objects this country had ever seen wouldn't need a crown to command respect. He'd have it anyway. Then the story gets stranger. A second grave sat only a few feet from the Archers. A younger man, 20 to 25 years old, buried nearby with his own set of goods. Excavators noticed something in the bones almost immediately. Both men shared calcaneonavicular tarsal coalition. Two men, buried side by side, sharing a trait that rare, is not a coincidence archaeologists ignore. The obvious read was family, father and son, or something close to it. The press, naturally, ran with Amesbury Archer's son, and for a while that felt like the tidy ending to a strange story. It wasn't the ending, it was another open thread. Because the companion, as archaeologists came to call him, had his own secrets in his bones. Isotope testing on his teeth suggested he was likely born in Britain, but spent part of his later childhood somewhere else entirely, possibly the same distant region as the Archer himself. So now there were two men buried together, sharing a rare genetic foot condition, and both showing signs of childhoods, split across two different worlds. If they were father and son, the story almost writes itself. A family moving between the continent and Britain, chasing metal, chasing opportunity, chasing whatever, pulled early beaker travelers across open water in small boats loaded with pottery and ambition. There was also something else in the Archer's skeleton that nobody could ignore. His left kneecap showed a severe injury, possibly an infection following trauma, that would have caused him to walk with a limp, likely in pain, for years before he died. A dental abscess in his jaw looked just as serious, the kind of infection that in this period could have been agonizing, even lethal if it had spread. Here was a man carrying real physical suffering, wealthy enough to be buried like nobody else in Britain, and possibly a stranger in the land where he died. Why would a wounded man, whoever he was, end up here, 3 miles from the biggest monument in prehistoric Europe instead of somewhere closer to wherever he came from? That question sat unanswered for years. Grave goods can tell you status. They can tell you culture, trade connections, even craft skill. What they can't tell you is where somebody grew up. For that, archaeologists needed something the pottery and the gold could never provide. They needed his teeth to talk. And in the mid-2000s, that's exactly what scientists set out to make them do. Teeth, it turns out, are quietly one of the most honest witnesses in archaeology. Enamel forms in childhood and never rebuilds itself the way bone does. Whatever water a child drinks, whatever ground they grow up on, gets locked into that enamel chemically and stays there for thousands of years. Researchers at the British Geological Survey, led by geochemist Jane Evans, took 2 of the Archer's teeth, formed at different points in his childhood, and tested them for oxygen and strontium isotopes. Oxygen isotopes track climate. Strontium tracks the geology under your feet as a child. Together, they can narrow down a person's likely homeland with real precision. The results came back consistent, and they came back cold, literally. The oxygen values in both teeth pointed to a childhood spent somewhere with a colder climate than almost anywhere in Britain, consistent with the Alpine region of Central Europe, an area stretching roughly across modern Switzerland, southern Germany, and Austria. Warm enough oxygen values do exist on Britain's extreme western coasts, but the strontium data ruled that out too. 2 separate chemical signatures, from 2 separate teeth, pointing in the same direction, This man did not grow up on the Salisbury Plain. He may not have grown up in Britain at all. For a moment, sit with what that actually means. The richest grave in early Bronze Age Britain, the one nicknamed for a monument that has come to symbolize British prehistory itself, most likely belonged to a foreigner, not a distant relative of the local farmers, not a native chieftain who'd earned his wealth through ancestral land or bloodline, a migrant, possibly an immigrant metalworker who crossed the sea from continental Europe and ended up buried spectacularly in the shadow of Stonehenge. That should have been the headline. King of Stonehenge quietly becomes a man who wasn't even from Stonehenge's country. But the story doesn't stop there, because the timeline attached to this discovery is about to make things worse for the original nickname, not better. Archaeologists have long argued over exactly when Stonehenge's most famous stones went up. The Sarsens, the enormous sandstone blocks hauled from West Woods, roughly 25 kilometers north, and raised into the trilithons, an outer circle that make the monument instantly recognizable today. The most widely accepted dating puts that construction phase around 2500 BC. Radiocarbon dating of the Archer's remains places his life somewhere between roughly 2470 and 2280 BC, meaning, by the most likely chronology, the giant stones may already have been standing before he was even born. Read that again. The man branded King of Stonehenge, the wealthiest individual buried anywhere near the monument in this entire period, quite possibly arrived after the hardest, most legendary work was already finished. He didn't raise the Sarsens. He may never have seen them go up at all. He inherited a monument someone else had already built. Archaeologists have been explicit about this. The label was never their claim. Some have floated an entirely different explanation for why a foreign, wounded metalworker might have traveled towards Stonehenge specifically. Researchers Timothy Darville and Geoffrey Wainwright proposed that the monument's blue stones, hauled from Wales, may have carried a reputation for healing power in prehistory, something like a Bronze Age site of pilgrimage. Under that theory, the Archer wasn't a builder or a king at all. He was a sick man traveling toward a place people believed could heal him. It's a compelling idea. It is also, by the researchers' own admission, a theory. Suggestive, not proven, resting on circumstantial timing rather than direct evidence. So the Archer's own story had already cracked twice. Not a king, not a builder, possibly not even healthy. And then science went further still, aiming not at the Archer this time, but at the man buried beside him, the companion, the one who shared that rare foot condition, the one everyone assumed was family. Modern ancient DNA techniques eventually reached both graves. Extracting usable genetic material from 4,000-year-old bone is difficult even now. The Archer's DNA turned out too degraded for full analysis in the first major studies. But researchers succeeded in sequencing genetic material from the companion, and later, through renewed and more sensitive testing, partial genetic data from the Archer himself. What came back complicated the tidy family story rather than confirming it. With limited overlapping genetic material to compare, researchers were able to rule out a close relationship of the first or second degree between the two men. No direct father-son link, at least not one the data could confirm. A distant relation, something like a great-grandfather and great-grandson generations apart, remains possible, but the neat, obvious reading, two family members traveling and dying together, turned out to be exactly the kind of assumption ancient DNA is built to challenge. Here's the pattern worth noticing. Every time a new piece of evidence arrived in this story, it didn't simply confirm what people already believed. It took something the public had accepted, a king, a father-son pair, a builder, and quietly dismantled it, piece by piece, using nothing but chemistry and probability. What the genetic data did show was more interesting than kinship. The Archer carried more early European farming ancestry than most beaker migrants tested from this period, a genetic outlier even among the newcomers he arrived with. And the biggest piece of evidence hadn't even arrived yet. In 2018, a team of geneticists, more than 100 archaeologists and researchers working together with senior scientists including David Reich of Harvard Medical School, Ian Barnes of the Natural History Museum, and lead author Inigo Olalde, published a study in the journal Nature that reached far beyond one grave. They had gathered genome-wide data from 400 ancient individuals across Europe, over 200 of them associated with the beaker culture, the same cultural package the Amesbury Archer belonged to. What they found when they compared British genomes before and after this period was almost too large to process at first. Somewhere around 90% of Britain's gene pool was replaced within a few hundred years, coinciding with the spread of beaker culture across the island. Not 90% of one village, not 90% of one region. Roughly 90% of the genetic ancestry of an entire population turned over in a window that, on an archaeological timescale, is barely the blink of an eye. The Y chromosome evidence made the shift even sharper. A particular male lineage, essentially absent in Neolithic British men, was found in more than 90% of the men tested from the beaker period onward. David Reich has described the scale and speed of this replacement as something researchers simply didn't expect going in. Sit with that for a second, because this is where the story stops being about one grave and becomes about everyone who was already here. The people who built Stonehenge, who quarried the Saracens, who hauled the bluestones 200 kilometers from Wales, who dragged, levered, and raised stones weighing up to 25 tons using nothing but timber, rope, and coordinated human effort, belonged to Neolithic farming communities that had lived on this island for well over 1,000 years. And within a handful of generations of the beaker culture's arrival, the descendants of those very builders had been almost entirely replaced genetically by people who looked, ate, worked metal, and buried their dead like the man in that Salisbury Museum case. The Amesbury Archer isn't just a rich foreigner anymore. He's a genetic preview, a single visible thread in a population-scale unraveling that swallowed nearly the entire ancestry of the people who built the most famous prehistoric monument on Earth. And here's the detail that makes this genuinely uncomfortable, the one most documentaries skip past. Nobody has found the mechanism. There's no mass grave from this period showing violence on the scale you'd need to explain a 90% replacement. No confirmed epidemic layer in the archaeological record from this specific transition. Genetic evidence of plague does exist in earlier Neolithic Britain, but it predates the beaker arrival by centuries and lacks the traits needed to spread as a true epidemic. No burned settlements stacked with bodies. Just the DNA itself, undeniable sitting in the data, refusing to explain how it happened. Migration on an enormous scale, a demographic collapse among the original population, disease that left no clear trace, generations of lower birth rates among Neolithic farming communities competing against incoming metal users. Every explanation on the table is plausible. None of them is proven. Archaeologists are still arguing about which one, or which combination, actually explains what the genomes are showing. That does not prove the population was invaded, or wiped out violently, or driven to extinction by force. It does not prove the wildest version of the story, but it does make the simple, comfortable version, peaceful cultural exchange, gradual blending, everybody getting along, much harder to defend with a straight face when the numbers say 90%. If the Archer represents the people replacing the builders, who were the actual builders? That question sends the investigation back to Stonehenge itself, not the Saracens, but the site's much older function as a cemetery. Long before the giant stones went up, Stonehenge held cremated human remains, some dating back to around 3000 BC, buried in a ring of chalk pits, now known as the Aubrey Holes. In 2018, researchers led by Christoph Snoke, working with Mike Parker Pearson's team, applied isotope analysis to 25 of these cremated individuals, largely recovered from Aubrey Hole 7 during earlier excavation work. Cremation destroys most bone chemistry, but not all of it. Carbon and strontium signatures can survive intense heat well enough to test. The results showed that at least 10 of the 25 individuals analyzed had not spent their lives on the chalk soil around Stonehenge at all. Their most plausible origin, based on the strontium ratios, was West Wales, the exact region the monument's bluestones were quarried from, roughly 200 kilometers away. Some of the carbon signatures even suggested cremation in denser woodland environments, more typical of Wales than the open Wiltshire landscape, hinting these people may have died and been burned elsewhere before their remains were carried to Stonehenge for final burial. That detail isn't new to everyone. A 1920s excavator named William Hawley, working the Aubrey holes decades before modern isotope science existed, noted that some of the cremated remains he found seemed to have been brought from somewhere distant for burial. He had no way to prove it. He just noticed it and wrote it down. It took nearly a century, and a laboratory technique he never could have imagined, to confirm that his instinct might have been right all along. Then there's another grave, found just 400 meters from the Amesbury Archer in 2003, a burial known as the Boscombe Bowman. Multiple individuals, commingled in a single grave, buried with 8 beaker pots, more than any other single grave in Britain, along with arrowheads that gave the group their name. Isotope testing on these remains pointed toward childhood origins in West Wales, or possibly the Lake District, the exact same geological signature tied to the bluestone quarries. It's not direct proof these specific people helped move the stones. But the pattern is hard to dismiss. People connected, geologically, to the bluestone source, buried within walking distance of Stonehenge. Around the same period, the monument was still active. Put those pieces side by side. Cremated remains inside Stonehenge itself, tied to Wales. A burial nearby, also tied to Wales. And 3 miles away, a wealthy foreign metalworker whose DNA and isotopes point toward the Alps, buried right as the population that built the monument was starting to vanish from the genetic record. This isn't one mystery anymore. It's a landscape of them, layered on top of each other, each pointing toward a different piece of a story nobody has fully assembled yet. The debate over what actually happened to Neolithic Britain hasn't gone quiet since 2018. If anything, it's intensified. Follow-up research, including a 2021 paper by Ian Armitt and David Reich, pushed the replacement estimate even higher, closer to 93%, and laid out 2 competing frameworks researchers still argue over. One treats this as a genuine colonization, large-scale movement of beaker populations physically displacing or outcompeting the people already living in Britain. The other, sometimes called step drift, imagines a slower, less dramatic demographic shift, still enormous in its outcome but without any single dramatic event driving it. Neither camp has definitively won. The genomes give you the what. They still can't give you the why or the how it actually felt on the ground for the people it happened to. What's not in dispute is what came after. Roughly 350 years after the Amesbury Archer was buried, another exceptionally rich grave went into the ground half a mile from Stonehenge Bush Barrow, excavated in 1808 by antiquarian William Cunnington, containing sheet gold lozenges, a bronze dagger with a hilt inlaid with thousands of tiny gold studs, a ceremonial mace head carved from fossil sponge, and a flanged bronze axe. By this point, roughly 1950 BC, the population shift wasn't a recent shock anymore. It was simply how Britain worked. A new elite had settled in, fully established, ruling over a landscape their ancestors had arrived in as outsiders only a few centuries earlier. Bush Barrow isn't evidence of the original builders reclaiming status. It's evidence of how completely the newcomers had taken root. Back in Salisbury Museum, the label on the Amesbury Archer's case still reads the way it did decades ago: King of Stonehenge. Visitors walk past, read 6 words, and move on with a version of history that isn't quite accurate, not because the museum is hiding anything, but because a catchy phrase from 2002 outlived the science that quietly corrected it. That's not a conspiracy. It's something more ordinary and, in its own way, more unsettling. A piece of misinformation nobody bothered to fully unwind. Because by the time the isotopes and the DNA came back, the nickname had already become the story people wanted to believe. The deeper implication reaches past this one glass case, into a question modern Britain doesn't often sit with directly. If nearly 90% of the ancestry in this landscape was replaced within a handful of generations around 2400 BC, then a significant share of British ancestry today doesn't trace primarily back to the people who quarried and raised Stonehenge's stones. It traces back to people like the Archer, travelers, migrants, metal workers who arrived from the European mainland, inherited a monument they didn't build, and within a few centuries became the dominant population of the island. Stonehenge stands as a monument built by one people and inherited almost immediately by another. The stones didn't move. The population around them did, almost completely, and almost without a trace of how. None of this makes the Amesbury Archer less remarkable. If anything, it makes him more important than the nickname ever did. He isn't interesting because he was a king who never existed. He's interesting because his teeth, his bones, and his grave goods captured a moment of genuine historical rupture. A population on the edge of disappearing, and the leading edge of the population about to replace them, buried within walking distance of each other, 3 miles from a monument that would outlast both. The isotopes have been tested, the DNA has been sequenced, the dates have been checked against the Sarsens more than once. And still, the deepest question in this story hasn't been answered. Not what happened to the people who raised Stonehenge, but why it happened so fast and so completely that 4,000 years later, scientists can prove it occurred and still can't fully explain how. Somewhere in Salisbury, behind glass that hasn't changed in 20 years, 2 small pieces of gold still catch the light exactly the way they did when they were pulled from the Wiltshire chalk in 2002. The label beside them still calls him a king. The science beside that label tells a stranger, quieter story of a wounded traveler from the Alps, buried near a monument he never built, standing in for an entire population that arrived from somewhere else, and within a few hundred years, quietly became almost everyone. The gold hasn't moved. The stones 3 miles away haven't moved. Only the story around them keeps shifting. One isotope, one genome at a time, and somewhere in a museum basement, the next correction is probably already waiting to be found.